Tips for hiring a finance manager in a startup or scale up. Hi, my name's Alysha Randall and I am a fractional CFO and I also run training courses in financial leadership foundations. And I wrote a book here that you can see here as well. It's how to become a CFO within a startup or scale up. So if that sounds like you, then please hit subscribe. I do video once a week and I talk about all the things that you need to know about in order to become a skilled and confident CFO within a startup or scale up. And today I wanted to talk about hiring a finance manager and what works for me and what doesn't. So because Fast Growth Consulting, my fractional CFO firm, we are often having to help our clients hire a finance manager. And generally, this is the first hire for the business. So when we come in, there's usually a bookkeeper and then they hire a finance manager. Now, you may have found that you were a finance manager or you've just started with a new company as head of finance or even finance director. And if they still have external bookkeepers and it's starting to become too much for them, you may find that the first hire you need to bring in is also a finance manager. Usually find it's either a finance manager or a financial analyst. Usually they're the two first hires. Sometimes you can keep the bookkeepers a bit longer because the volume's quite small, particularly if you are tech SaaS and a lot of things are quite digital and quite automatic, particularly around sales. But if you're having to raise invoices, there's a lot of credit control or FMCG, for example, or some other business where there is a lot of financial operations still, even if you've automated a lot of things, and then potentially a finance manager will need to be hired in-house. It's also often better because then you have somebody in-house that understands the business a bit more. And so they can help you because they have that understanding, that bigger picture. They understand the culture a bit better. When there is a quick pivot or there's a firefighting, you have a resource there to help you. So in general, I do prefer a finance manager in-house when it starts getting to a certain level. So today, because it is a role that is hired quite regularly, and again is often the first one, I just wanted to go through the process of hiring a finance manager. Not the basics, I'm going to assume you know how to hire people, but just some additional suggestions and tips, just because I probably have to hire a finance manager every couple of months for the last 10 years. Just because I work with lots of different clients. I'm currently hiring a finance manager right now. If this was like a live stream, I would say if you know any part-time finance managers, let me know. But because it's not, then there's probably not relevant anymore. But as I said, I am hiring a finance manager quite regularly. I remember more at the beginning of my finance leadership role, hiring the more junior people. It was even more frequent than what it is now, just because you would have an accounts payable clerk, a payroll clerk, bank reconciliation clerk, accounts receivable clerk, assistant manager, and then the finance manager or financial controller. Whereas nowadays, particularly in the startup scale-up world, generally you just need a finance manager and a financial analyst at the more junior levels, just because of automation. I don't see these roles disappearing too quickly. I do see the role changing in the fact that they're probably dealing with exceptions and the process before and after AI kicks in, and probably reviewing a bit more and looking at, as I said, the exceptions more so than actually doing the manual work. So I don't see this role disappearing so much. I just see it changing. So I do feel that a finance manager role will be the most junior role in a finance department, but it'll just, as I said, it'll just be different than what it is today. So one of the first things I would highly recommend that you do long before you start putting a job spec together is working out quite clearly about what this person needs to do. So usually a finance manager will have to do or manage rather the accounts payable, accounts receivable, bank reconciliation, those kind of things. Obviously, the software is doing most of it, but there does need to be someone that manages it. Just on a side note, if you do want to understand the finance tech stack that we use with startups, so this is before you implement an ERP, then take a look at my latest recommendations. I'll link that above and below. And that will give you an overview of how you can automate those kind of financial operations. But anyway, so back to it. So generally they're doing those, and then they're doing things like preparing the management account. So they'll have to manage the fixed assets, accruals, prepayments, deferred income, often payroll. It sits within finance management. So you do want to just confirm that. And doing the basic reports, updating cash flows, those kind of things. So you do need to think about how much more do you want to add to that role, or be quite specific in it. So for example, financial reporting, the stat accounts. If you're a fintech, you have to do regulated reporting. In the UK, it's to the FCA. So if they have to do those kind of tasks as well, or you want them to have at least a basic understanding, you may want to consider how qualified they are. So sometimes if it's more of a junior finance manager, they could be part qualified, and that's fine. They may have started their qualification with a firm or in industry, and you're happy with part qualified, and you can take them through that journey. Obviously, if you do that, you will be expected to support them in their studies. But also, it's a nice way of bringing someone up within the company. Hopefully, you'll get a little bit more loyalty and retention if you're willing to do that. But if you want somebody to be more involved in the technical side of the business, then you will need to consider that they may need to be at post-qualification. And if you want them to have a stronger technical knowledge, you may even want them to be more ACCA or ICA or CPA rather than the more management accounting type qualifications. For me personally, I personally don't mind if they have the more management account qualifications, just because understanding IFRS, GAAP, all the different type of rules, that can be taught quite well, and generally you'll have a tax partner as a third party that you'll be leaning on anyway. So I usually don't mind what qualification someone has. I'm usually trying to decide whether they should be part qualified or fully qualified, depending on the level of the role. The other one that is worthwhile thinking about is whether they're going to do the cash flow management. So if you want somebody to do that, you do want them to have a level of understanding of the cash flow. It's not just the technical side of things, but having a bit of awareness, a commercial awareness. So for example, if they're putting the weekly, say, cash flow together, hopefully using some tools to help you, if not, Excel's fine, and they can see that there may be some problems, or there's something that needs to be done to improve the cash flow, they have the initiative to do that or make recommendations. So again, that may sit with you, but if you really do need someone to be really on it, just because cash flow is a real problem. So in this instance, I'm thinking of more an FMCG company, so fast moving consumer goods, where cash flow is always tight, just because the margins are small and you're having to pay for inventory up front. So if you're in that kind of industry and you want somebody to have a better understanding of cash flow management, you may need to stipulate that, and also you may need to test them those specific skills during an interview process. So the other things that you may want to think about is risk management. Do you want them to maintain a risk register, and therefore they may need some business partnership type skills? So are they quite introverted, that stereotypical accountant that is happy to just work on their own and not talk to anyone? Or do you want them to be out in the business and understanding the risk register, for example? And then financial compliance. So again, if you're fintech or insurtech, you're regulated, they need to understand the regulation, or even B Corp. Are they going to have the skills to be able to maintain that regulation? So ideally, you just want to list all of the different things that this person's going to be responsible for, and then work out what are the skills that they need for each of those different tasks. And then that's what you base your job spec and ideally your questions on. when you are interviewing someone or reviewing CVs, obviously there's a few things that you need to consider. I like to be quite objective here, so I would make a list like I would for a tender when I'm comparing accounting firms. I make a list of all the things that I want this person to have. I put the candidates up the top, the ones that I like, and I put an X or a dot or whatever it is in the box if they've got those particular skills that I want them to have. Generally, that just helps me make my decision a bit clearer. Because I'm external and a fractional CFO, generally I am doing the skills check and then somebody else within the company is doing the culture check. So for me, it's much easier to be quite objective because I'm looking at the technical, the skills, whether they're able to do the job or not. So I can be quite objective, but appreciate that obviously you need to do a culture check as well, and it's harder to be objective there. But it is worthwhile for the things that you can be objective for. It is worthwhile. So you do need to consider whether you want them to be qualified or part qualified. That is a very objective decision. As I have done in many times, sometimes they're part qualified when I want them to be fully qualified, but I have a really good feeling for them. They're really ambitious. They have all the other skills that I want them to have. And so obviously this isn't okay, I want someone who's qualified. These guys are part qualified. Therefore, they're a definite no. It is weighing up the pros and cons of all of the different elements. Ideally, you do want someone to have experience in the role and have experience within the certain things, and even what would be super lovely is they understand the industry. But because one of the more junior roles, you're not hiring a finance director or a CFO, industry experience for me is generally a nice to have. Sometimes what I find more interesting is whether they have startup or scale up experience or not. So if it is a finance manager role, they are expected to hit the ground running quite quickly. I'm an external fractional CFO. I need somebody to on it. I don't have the time to train them. Then for me, when I'm hiring someone, I don't like someone from an accounting firm just because I'm not there to get them to transfer from one industry to another. However, when I was a finance director at Love Film, for example, my second in charge 2IC group finance controller, she was directly from audit. But I was in-house. I was able to help her with that industry change. And the skill that I needed for a group financial controller was relatively similar to an auditor. So it made total sense. So again, you just need to think about what works for you, the business, the role, and how much interaction you have with this person. The other thing when you're thinking about the experience is, again, I keep going back to FMCG, but just because it's one extreme to the other. So if, for example, you are hiring within an FMCG, and you have somebody that's worked in manufacturing, they understand inventory, they understand finished goods, they understand work in progress. So even though manufacturing and FMCG is different, there is some synergies there. And so therefore that kind of industry experience is quite interesting. If you're comparing, say, somebody that's worked in manufacturing, say, versus tech SaaS, whereas in tech SaaS, there is no inventory. It's quite a different business model. They're more on the R&D side, and then everything's kind of digitalized. So you can obviously move around within industries, but just think about what are the most important skill set and whether they are able to demonstrate that skill set in another industry. The auditor and the group financial controller is another perfect example of that. Strong communication skills, I would say that they are quite important in a startup or scale up because it is a smaller team, it is a flatter hierarchy, and it is a very specific culture. Again, if you want to understand what the startup and scale up culture is like, I've done a video on that as well, so I'll leave a link for that above and below. But essentially, you do want somebody that is able to communicate quite well, whether that's written or verbal, or ideally both, especially in this hybrid working world, still within startups and scale ups. this person will have to interact with the rest of the business quite a lot. Whether it's invoices, delivering reporting, a little bit of business partnership, payroll. There's lots of different reasons why this person has to communicate. So make sure that they're able to communicate clearly and simply. I would also say a flexibility and adaptability is also really important. Again, this is more of a cultural thing. If you are hiring within a startup or scale up, you do need someone that is able to be quite flexible and adaptable. If you haven't worked within a startup for long, you're going to find out quite quickly that not only do fires happen regularly and you have to put them out quite quickly, but also the business model may change. You may move into a new product overnight, which seemingly overnight. You may be deciding to move into a new region within a couple of months. So you need a finance manager that can change quite quickly as well. They may have to put in a quick win that is a bit back of the envelope, and then replace it with a proper process once this change has been embedded into the business. So having somebody that is able to do that is really important. Attention to detail, I think, is very important, obviously. I mean, I don't think this is a startup or scale up thing. I think this is across the board in our industry. So they need to be able to have an attention to detail. It doesn't have to be their default. So me personally, I much prefer high level. I'm a high level thinker first, and then I'll go into the detail. A lot of people who are in the accounting field are the opposite. That's fine. Sometimes it might be worthwhile testing this to be the opposite of what you are. So again, for me personally, because I'm more of a high level person, I like big picture. Whenever I'm interviewing someone within my team, I always look for someone with attention to detail so that we can bring those skills to each other's work. So just have a think about what is best for your team and working with you, particularly because it may just be you and this other person in the team. So if there's only the two of you, ideally, you don't want to hire a mini-me. Technical proficiency and implementation skills, I would say implementation is being able to implement something. I think would be really important again for this role. It's off the back of change and having some initiative as well. If something doesn't look right, you want the finance manager to tell you that it doesn't look right and come up with ideas as to how they can change this or fix this problem. You don't want to have to do that all on your own all the time, particularly because they're the ones in the detail. So I like to always ask questions about whether they can give me an example of when they took some initiative and changed a process. So they're the things that I look for when I'm hiring a finance manager. I generally will also always do a test as well. Not really an Excel test anymore because you can just ask ChatGPT to do it, but more how they think about things, how they interpret data, things like this. I'm actually quite surprised how often the tests are quite different from one candidate to another. Sometimes I find they're very good in the verbal interview but terrible on the test, or vice versa. You want to hire the one that's both. So I definitely would recommend doing some kind of test. You can just Google it or get ChatGPT to put it together for you. And that's really useful. And definitely interview them more than once. And I would recommend that anyone that's going to be working with them regularly, so whether it's HR manager, whether it's the head of operations, or even the managing director or the COO, whoever, I would definitely get one or two other people to interview them as well, because if they're going to be working with them regularly, you want them to have a good rapport. That is my recommendations for hiring a finance manager and all the things to think about. I do weekly videos to help you with your finance career within a startup and scale up. And if you're interested in watching videos, please click subscribe. Otherwise, I'll leave a link for my book and program below, and you can check those out as well. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.